Relationships. It either is heaven or it's hell. And quite frankly, most of the time it's kind of a mixture of both. And the question is, how do we end up in a relationship that we can develop to the point where there's really great communication, where we eliminate some of the challenges that come up and we really experience that relationship that we desire and that we've dreamed of all our lives. Well, I'm really happy today to have Joyce Schafers on the show with us. She is a relationship coach and has done an incredible amount of work with couples in helping them to repair or to develop wonderful relationships. So I hope you'll join us. I think you're going to find it fascinating.
At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Joyce, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm doing really good. Thank you.
Well, I'm really excited to have you on the show. I think the topic that you're going to talk about today is just fascinating and so imperative in today's modern world and what's going on. I'd love for you to share a little bit about what's your history and what motivated you to move this direction into doing what you're doing now.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm actually a life skills coach. So I've been a life skills coach over 25 years now. And we were actually trained to deliver 10-week programs to people who are incarcerated. So the idea is that a lot of people experience some pretty significant childhood trauma. Trauma creates a lot of emotional pain, and typically children aren't equipped with the skills to deal with all of those emotions. So they tend to come out sideways in all kinds of negative forms like breaking the law, substance abuse, relationship problems. So my training is heavily focused on helping people become emotionally aware, identify emotions and process them as a way for these negative trauma emotions to stop kind of wreaking havoc on people's lives. So I see such value in this type of training because I feel like we don't put enough emphasis these days on processing emotions. Now, that was way back 25, almost 30 years ago. And I ended up not working in the prison setting, and it was because of my own sister's murder. Back then, it would have been too triggersome for me to be in that environment. And it ended up being very much on purpose because I took all the work that I did. So I geared it toward corporations. So I did a lot of professional development and I did a lot of workshops. And that eventually turned into, one-on-one counseling, which then transitioned into relationships. So really, the process, I became very clear that it's not just people incarcerated that have trauma. Of course, it varies in significance and degree of significance.
Sure.
I started to see that majority of the people had childhood trauma that wasn't processed. So I took my work and geared it toward the mainstream and started working with people in that way. But really, how I ended up focusing on relationships was actually to end my own pattern of failed relationships. So I had a pattern of failed relationships, 3 relationships, all with alcoholic men, all with them leaving me for other women. So as tempting as it would have been for, to blame everything on my ex-husband when he left me, I realized, I was a common denominator in this pattern of failed relationships. So it became my number one goal to not only identify the root, the thing that caused that pattern. I needed it to end. It was a breaking point kind of scenario for me. I wasn't prepared to be in another failed relationship. It was kind of like not an option, right? So the counseling model that I currently use today was actually born out of my need to identify the problem that caused my pattern of failed relationships, but to deal with it, to break that pattern. So the counseling model that I created, I call it the cycle of emotional pain. And it really is based on this idea that childhood trauma creates emotional pain. And unless we deal with that, it will create all kinds of problems. For me, it was a pattern of failed relationships. So really what it came down to is, although my trauma was very mild and insignificant compared to most, it did create this feeling inside of myself where I believed I wasn't important. I felt like I wasn't wanted. And instead of dealing with those emotions, what I was trying to do was use the love of a man to prove that those things were false. Of course, that doesn't work. I kind of call that, it's kind of like using mud to wash your hair. I was using at a physical person to try and heal emotional wounds. And of course, it finally dawned on me, this light bulb moment. It's like, well, duh, Joyce, if it's an emotional problem, you should probably heal it or deal with it using the emotions. So it was a huge process going over many years. But that's the evolution of it. So with me understanding my own broken bits, how they were responsible for causing a very significant problem in my life, and then learning to deal with those emotions so that I could break that pattern.
All right. So I'm curious because I think many, many people, in fact, I was having a chat with a friend the other day, and we were talking about how many times they have heard women talk about how unhappy they are in their marriages when they're all getting together for some kind of social event. And I think there's probably more people out there that are not happy in those relationships than we understand. You talk about failed relationships, and believe me, I get it. But what do you feel like? Is there a preventative, or is there something that we need to be aware of before we ever get into a relationship? Or are there areas that we want to make sure we take the time in those relationships? So let's talk a little bit about that. First of all, you appear to, from what you're saying, you were attracted to men who ultimately became alcoholic and were not faithful to you. And I appreciate the fact that, yes, we all have our own responsibilities in some of those failed relationships. But what is it that causes us to be attracted to a certain culture, type of individual? And is that something that we can handle before we even get into a relationship?
Absolutely. So for me, my theory is that what is considered normal in our early childhood. So, and this is again where a lot of trauma takes place. So whatever is considered normal in early childhood, it's like it becomes a subconscious expectation for more of the same. So in other words, you take a child who was severely beaten, say in their childhood. Well, on a certain level, on the subconscious level, what that does to a child is says, well, this is normal. So then I come to expect more of the same. So that's where you would find perhaps sometimes a child who was severely abused will be in abusive relationships, not certainly because they want to in a conscious level, but it's because of this normalization of trauma in childhood, which tells them, well, this is normal. So it's okay to expect more of the same, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. And I've noticed that sometimes there are influences from childhood, whether it's social, religious, or whatever, that can have an effect in different ways. What has been your experience with that?
Yeah, well, it absolutely sets the stage for, like I said, more of the same. So in my personal scenario, so I came from a very large family. My parents were German in heritage, and I don't know if you know much about the German culture, but there's very little emphasis on nurturing emotionally. No, through my entire childhood, never once did I hear the words "I love you." Also, very little affection. Now, that is by no means severe childhood trauma, but my definition of trauma is that something that creates emotional pain for the child that they don't know how to deal with. So in that case, I always remember thinking it is kind of weird, like, how come we don't say I love you? So although I kind of figured my parents loved me, I was still a little bit confused by that. So it created this question, well, am I loved? And then, combined with my parents had 5 kids in 6 years, and then 6 years went by and I was born. So I was often told like I was a mistake, I wasn't planned, I was an accident. So, combining those two things, it made me as a child draw a conclusion that I wasn't wanted and that I wasn't loved. And I really didn't feel that important. Now, from my parents' side, if they were here today, would they agree with that? Probably not, right? But again, it's more about the child's experience. So those early childhood experiences, not only does it oftentimes create emotional pain, but it creates a story that the child kind of drags around with them. And again, it's more like if you have a computer, you see in the background there's this operating system that you don't really see. Well, our stories are the same. We're not often aware, because again, it was all normalized, right? We're not often aware of what that story is that's running in the background. And for me, it was this constant on repeat, nagging feeling that I wasn't important, that I wasn't wanted. So my solution was to look for, because of the conditioning in our society that says the answer's out there, right? My answer was in the form of a man. But again, of course, that will always fail, because emotional needs require the emotions to deal with them rather than physical. So a person will never did ever make me feel loved, wanted, and important. It had to be dealt with on that emotional route. So those early childhood situations often create more of the same. So if couples come to me, struggling in their relationship, and what most couples describe, they describe fighting over one or two hot topics. Okay. It could be finances, it could be sex and intimacy, helping around the house, parenting. Those hot topics are actually, what's happening in those hot topics is that the behaviors of one person are actually triggering the old trauma wounds of the other person. And that person's response will then trigger the first person's childhood wounds. And so you end up having both people are triggered, which means they're swimming in intense negative emotions because it's linked to trauma. So it's intense, it's not pleasant. And also what's happening is it's like, so all of those intense emotions are pulled from the past and dumped into the future, into the present day. But also what's happening is that the wounded child, the child who was traumatized, is actually it's almost like they're transported back in time, from time into the present as well, handling the situation, how they coped with the trauma as a child. So here you have a very much of an attack defend dynamic. And one of my clients described it. He said, so you mean it's kind of like two kids in a sandbox throwing sand at each other? And that's exactly how I would put it, because both people's wounds have been activated. They're many times are completely unaware that that's happening, right? So we think when we're triggered, a triggered mind says, you're the problem, you're the enemy, because what you're saying and doing is hurting me so badly. And I think that's only partly true. Sometimes, yes, behaviors obviously do need to be tweaked. We want to move away from the hurtful, harmful behaviors toward the healthy,
Right.
helpful ones. But what most people do is completely ignore, because they're not aware of it, of all the emotional wounds that have been activated. So instead of the triggered mind saying, you're the problem, you're the bad guy, and if you must stop so I can feel better, my approach is saying, okay, interesting, I see that whenever you do these certain things, it actually activates these old wounds, whether I linked to abandonment or inadequacy or rejection. They're activating my wounds. So because they're my wounds, then I need to withdraw that focus from the other person and focus it on where the problem truly is, which is on the wounds, right? So we want to become really aware in terms of your question of like, how can we prevent or how can we prepare ourselves to be healthy in relationships? I would absolutely say it's so crucial to understand the trauma, understand the emotional pain it created, and then understand all the things that trigger or activate it. And then once we know what those triggers are and we know what the emotions are they are activating, well, we can tend to those wounds using emotions. So for couples who are engaged, I have a lot of couples that want to come to me as a proactive thing. I absolutely love that. And this is what I teach them, is just to recognize a trigger is something that mimics childhood trauma or it evokes the same emotions, and to help them really recognize, like, oh, right, every time he says or does this, or she says or does this, this activates my own wounds, which I've drug into the relationship, right? And so therefore, it's my responsibility to deal with those emotional wounds. Does that make sense?
Well, it does to some degree, and I'm gonna ask some more questions about that. But you talk about couples that are engaged or getting ready to get married and so forth, and they come to you proactively. I've read a couple of interesting articles that talk about how it takes almost a year. Sometimes it can take up to 2 years to really discover who that other person is. And, because so often we have this social veneer that particularly in romantic relationships, we want to be on our best, best behavior, so on and so forth. And then we have that romance built up in that dream and thought process in our mind. And I've seen what happens is that after a year or two, all of a sudden, these red flags come up and these issues come up that can be devastating. So, and in some cases, yes, they can be worked through, but in some cases they can't.
Mhm.
Your
Right.
example, abuse, alcohol, out there being untrue to you, you probably would have not seen that right off the bat, or you probably wouldn't have married him. But so, what do you recommend, or how do you suggest to people, how long should they be in these relationships prior to realizing that, okay, you know what, we are good enough friends, we've developed this good enough communication, and we're discovering some of these triggers, but we're be able to work through them? How long does that take?
Well, let's just talk about two of those points. For the first one is the red flags. Okay. So let's understand first what's actually happening when we ignore red flags, because sometimes there are red flags and sometimes we ignore them. So what's happening is I always talk in terms of empty cup and a full cup. As an empty cup, I believed I wasn't important. I believed, and I felt that way. I believed I wasn't good enough and not lovable. And so I believed that intellectually, I felt that emotionally. But then when I had a man say, pay attention to me, okay, well, there's this me, if you can imagine, it's almost like an addict getting a hit. So I'm needing love. I'm needing that proof outside of myself that, I'm loved and important. Well, when a man was giving me attention, it was like I was an addict and I was like, just focusing on that. It's like here he's somehow magically meeting my emotional needs. And in those instances, it's like if you it is almost like you have to understand the addicted mind in a way, because it's like going for that hit, ignoring all the red flags. It's kind of like when people reach for alcohol. It's like they think it's going to give them something emotionally, but really they're ignoring all the harm it causes. Okay, so when we understand our trauma and our emotional wounds caused by it, it does tend to put us in a better position of recognizing. It's like, oh wait, I'm this person is somehow filling my empty cup, and because that feels so good, I'm going to ignore the red flags. Well, if you can imagine, we understand what our trauma is and we learn to fill our own emotional cup. So for me, learning to prove to myself I was important, no more important than anyone else, proving to myself I was lovable and good enough, no more lovable or better than anyone else, but I was enough, right? Having learned to fill my own emotional cup, well, and not need anything really emotionally, I'd done it for myself. Well, then that put me in a position of being very aware of red flags, because I'm not needing anything from that person emotionally in the way of healing old wounds. I've done that. So now I can see the red flags, because that it's like that veil is lifted and I've met my own emotional needs. Does that make sense?
It does. And once you've seen those red flags, if you really have become you,
A
okay,
full
if you
cup.
really
Yep.
have
Yeah.
ultimately done that introspective work and feel, yeah, and it's never over. I
Right.
understand that, but as we get to that point, and then you start to see red flags in a potential relationship, at what point in time do you decide, you know what, I really, really care for this person, but bottom line is there's some red flags here that I know do not fit well with me and
Yeah.
ultimately could destroy a relationship long term.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably different for everyone, but I think the key point there is that it's all comes down to need versus want, right? When we need to be in a relationship because, oh my goodness, this person is making me feel so good, we are tend to miss the red flags. We're not even want to look at red flags, right? So, but however, when we think, do I want to be this with this person? Well, it becomes it's quite easy then to say, no, there's too many red flags. I don't need this person. I want, do I want to be with them? Well, if there's too many red flags, the answer is usually no. So I think in terms of when I think when you're a full cup, you spot those red flags quite early on, and you don't ignore them. So I think it happens as a full cup. We can kind of move out of those relationships quite quickly because we're not coming from that empty, needy, please fill me up kind of position, if that makes sense.
Well, it does. And in your experience of counseling, have you found that there's a time period that it takes for some of those red flags to really start to show up? Because we're really good at hiding those.
Yeah. And I think it's an individual thing. It's hard to know for sure. I think for me personally, after I spent 5 years completely single, really working on filling my empty cup, really being in a very, very healthy position. Well, I think of my, first two dates with my husband today, I was all about, let's see those red flags. And had I seen things that were troublesome, I don't think there would have been a third date, so
Yeah.
it really makes a difference between, dragging these unhealthy relationships out because we think, oh, well, in some ways I need this person so desperately, versus no, I don't. I want to be with you, maybe if there's no red flags versus needing to. So I think it can happen very early on if we're open to seeing the red flags and if we're showing up in those interactions as a full cup. You know, I, I
Okay.
I think it is an individual thing, but I tend to think it happens very early on, very, very early on. Once you've really, you have done that work to meet your own emotional needs. There is, as much as I absolutely love and adore my husband, and in some ways I need him, but I don't need him to heal my old trauma wounds, right? And that's where the problem is that we think that these people are this magic, bullet to this problem that, again, most people are very unaware just how much their childhood trauma is wreaking havoc on their life. So if we can even just back up way to the beginning, like, what is the trauma? What is the emotional pain? And how can I learn to tend to those wounds myself, even before getting into a relationship? I mean, that's ideal, right? But if
Yeah. It
that
doesn't happen a lot, though.
doesn't happen a lot, it is rare. You are absolutely right. Hence, then the next part of your question is, you're in this relationship now, say you're even married and things were great in the beginning, and what happens is the triggers do start to activate. Okay, so again, take an example of someone who was maybe abandoned by a parent as a child. Well, as time goes on, simply something as simple as their partner not replying to texts in a timely manner can be a trigger that will activate those feelings of feeling abandoned and alone and unimportant and unloved. Do you see? So it just does depend. Again, I'd say it's an individual thing, but those behaviors will start as the people start living together in daily life. Those behaviors will start happening, and those old trauma wounds will absolutely be triggered and activated. So do I know exactly 2 years, 3 years? I don't know, but I think it absolutely does start to happen kind of after that, that dreamy beginning stage is kind of slowing down a bit, which that even in itself really doesn't have to happen, especially if I think what the problem with triggers is that it creates a lot of divisiveness and separation, because again, of what the triggered mind is saying. They're saying, oh, every time my husband doesn't reply to that text, he doesn't love me, he's abandoning me, right? And again, not conscious, but if that's kind of the processing behind it, you see how quickly that creates that separation between the two, right? And then it starts with that attack, defend, kind of blame game. Well, you should text me back. And then maybe the husband's going, well, I was at work, like really confused, like, why is this so upsetting, right? Without all what I call the backstory, the trauma and the emotional pain from childhood, without knowing all of that, so many couples are just absolutely confused as, why is my partner responding so intensely to this one thing? Well, and that's because it's a trigger, and a trigger is designed to activate our old wounds. But if couples aren't aware that that's happening and don't have that understanding of the backstory, well, how can they possibly navigate these conversations? These hot topics create a lot of volatility with no solution in sight, because you're not focusing on what the real problem is, this old trauma that's been activated. Do you see?
Well, I do. And then you get into an interesting conundrum. Here you are in a relationship. And if you start to understand this, ideally you've done it before, but most people haven't. So here you are in a relationship, and all of a sudden these things start to come up.
Yeah.
And I remember someone telling me, you should never say this to your person, that you love, your special person, but you should. And when you see a trigger come up, it's like, hey, what emotion did my action just bring up that's causing this emotional reaction? And of course, we need to do that for ourselves. And how important is the communication to be able to say, Joyce, what you just did really brought a trigger up within me.
Mm-hmm.
And then to communicate and talk about that. Now, if the other person is willing to listen and to understand and to say, okay, I get that, and I will work on that, and meanwhile, please understand, I get the fact that I'm trying to do this a little bit better. How important is that communication, and how important is it that both people are willing to look at that and realize, wow, you know what, it isn't them, potentially it's me, or the fact that we're not able to communicate what's really going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, communication is huge, but in the work that I do with my couples, that comes a little bit down the line, right? Because if a lot of times, some solutions or some strategies are to, help teach effective communication strategies. Now, my experience is all the communication strategies in the world are going to be completely useless if you don't actually know what to talk about. Okay, so you take an example. I have an example. So I had a couple come to me, and they always fought about the husband coming home late for work. He was never on time for dinner. Okay, so this is not, it's definitely an unhealthy behavior that we want to tweak, right? But it's definitely not like a conversation involving infidelity. It's kind of like, please come home on time for dinner. Okay,
Right.
but this conversation always spiraled out of control. Okay, so this couple thought they needed to improve their communication skills. They thought, well, how is this simply this conversation about being home late for dinner? How does this go sideways so badly? We must be poor communicators, is what they thought, right? But again, my approach is about understanding what's causing the communication to break down in the first place, which is activated trauma from the past. So in that example, the husband, I learned that his dad was extremely critical, never praised him, right? The other thing is he was bullied for about 8 years in school. Both of those I would call trauma, and they created that deep sense of inadequacy. He described feeling like he was never, ever good enough. Okay, so that's his backstory. The wife, on the other hand, her trauma was that when her and her brother were teenagers, they got into an argument and he drove off and died in a car crash. Okay. That trauma can be like one-time incidents like that as well. In her case, it caused all this fear and anxiety around conflict. So that's their backstories. Now you fast forward to one of their hot topics, which was him being home late for dinner. Well, what was happening is every time she would criticize him for being late, on a subconscious level, it would remind him of being criticized by his father. It would activate or trigger that deep sense of inadequacy. His response would be to get defensive, and then guess what he would do? He'd hop in his car. He'd hop in his car and drive away. And you're right, he would always be late. Like, he never did tweak the behavior. So, but every time he'd hop in his car and drive away, it would trigger her trauma. When her brother drove off and died in a car crash, she'd become, worried and afraid and extremely aggressive in her communication. So we have this attack defend dynamic, all based on him being home late for dinner. And without understanding the backstory, without understanding the trauma and how they were triggering each other, do you see how just throwing communication strategies at that would never have worked? And I've worked with some exceptionally skilled communicators, and they still were not able to resolve their hot topics because they weren't talking about what was really going on. So when I'm working with couples, I develop this strategy. I call it administering emotional first aid. It's about really recognizing when our spouse is triggered, recognizing now they're swimming in that swamp of trauma emotion. They're believing their old story about themselves, their worthlessness, or they're not good enough. So the other spouse, when you can recognize your spouse is triggered, I get people to try and look at them as if they had a physical wound. Imagine you walk in and your spouse is on the floor and they're gaping wound, blood everywhere. Well, you drop everything and tend to the wound, right? That's what I promote when I'm working with my couples, is like looking at your spouse as though they've got a physical wound. And do you want to tend to it? Of course, most people do, right? So it's about recognizing that person is wounded, and now I want to lean in and tend to their wounds. So that's how we can actually help the other person when they're triggered. And on the flip side, when we recognize we're triggered, well, then it's all about, identifying the trigger, identifying the emotions, and learning to communicate using I statements. I'm triggered right now. I feel abandoned when you didn't text me back. It's about bringing attention to the wound and focusing there, where most people tend to, when they're triggered, use you statements. You're inconsiderate. You don't care about me. You don't love me, right? And of course, that's going to cause things to spiral. So we always want to be bringing attention when we're triggered, to bring attention either to our own wound or to our spouse's wound, and really learn how to communicate on that level using I statements, administering emotional first aid. But it really is about love and support. When we do that attack, defend, blame game, it's kind of like we're pouring salt on each other's wounds, rather than I promote, let's learn to tend to each other's wounds. And that creates so much more love and compassion. So
well, it really does. And, as you say, that I used to tell people, you know what, if you're struggling with what's going on here, just take a mirror and put it up in front of you, because
right.
There's the problem. It's not them, it's you.
Right.
And it isn't that it's the problem, as you say, there are those emotional traumas and triggers that come up. So what do you do? Have you faced the dilemma where you've got one spouse that is really willing to do that personal development and really become aware of what those are and understand that, and the other spouse just wants nothing to do with that?
Yeah, I do. And I always say it, I always do a consultation call usually with my couples beforehand, because I always want to be looking for two things. The first is that commitment, that, both people are still committed to each other and the relationship. So commitment is huge, number one thing that's needed. The second thing is exactly what you're talking about, is that ability to look in the mirror and say, there are things in me that maybe I need to tweak so I can show up better in the relationship. Okay, so I've noticed that there is a small percentage of the population who find it almost impossible to admit when they're wrong. They rarely, say sorry. It's like it's like an intense aversion to being held accountable to their behaviors. And I personally think that it is linked to their own childhood trauma, the type of trauma that causes them to feel shame and guilt and even really bad about who they are. Okay. This is
Mhm.
just a theory. I'd love to do a study, haven't been able to, but that idea that if a child has this trauma that makes them feel so ashamed of who they are and so guilty and bad, those are the adults who have a very difficult time owning up to the problems they cause in the relationship. So it does happen. It's not super often, but it is extremely problematic because if one person in the relationship refuses to deal with their own broken bits, well, the other person has to either accept that everything's always their fault, which isn't very fair, certainly doesn't feel good, and it's completely unrealistic, or they basically have to accept that because problems really can't be resolved because rarely is it one person's fault, right? It takes two to tango. So that's kind of the rule of thumb. Are both people committed? Has no one person flipped that done switch, right? They're both still in
Right.
it. And then do both people have that ability to look in the mirror and say, yeah, there's some things that I should tweak? Because if we can get to that point, really, what's there to argue about? Like say if I had a harsh tone with my husband, and if I say to him, I am sorry, that tone was, you didn't deserve that, that's disrespectful, and I'm sorry about that. Well, what's there to argue about? He doesn't have to argue
Exactly.
with me, right? Because I'm always assessing, or as much as possible assessing how I'm showing up in my relationship. So if people can do that, it just really any problem is solvable.
So what you're saying is, if I'm hearing you right, is as you were looking at getting into a relationship for all of those young people and others that are, one of the important elements would be number one, are you willing to do the work? Number
Mhm.
two, are they willing to do the work?
Right,
And a
right,
big red flag would be if they're not willing to do the work,
right.
down the road, you're going to have issues that may not be resolvable. Let me ask you a question. Narcissism, that word is used so abundantly, and I don't really like that. But I find that what you're describing sometimes, someone is just so, it's all about them. It's always all
Mhm.
about them.
Yeah.
What brings that about? Have you ever been able to tie childhood incidents to narcissism, or is it just something that they've developed and that's just kind of who they are and they want to feel important and no one else matters?
I kind of avoid labels. I like to look at
I
each
do too.
person.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to look at each person individually. So I don't necessarily diagnose or label people as narcissists or this or that. For me, I think that, but I do have a theory, and I think that a narcissist is just such a deeply wounded person because those are the types who refuse to look at their part in problems, which again is a fairly significant character defect or trait of a narcissist, right? It's always blaming. No one, they're never responsible for the problems in their life. It's always everyone else's fault. So I personally think I always say, like, I would say our biggest problems today, the things that cause us the most difficulty, absolutely have a link that you can connect the dots 99% of the time to childhood trauma that hasn't been resolved or dealt with. So that would be, I always take this curiosity approach. So these behaviors we are seeing today, what is the root? And is it possible it's linked to old wounds that have still never been dealt with? And I would say most times it is.
Okay, so back to, and you've talked about this, so let's just kind of as a final thought, what are the two main qualities that are going to make a difference in a relationship?
Yeah, and really it's the commitment that, that there's no kind of plan B in the back of the person's mind. There are some people who are wired for commitment, who will basically if there's a problem in front of them with their partner, they're going to lean in and say, let's deal with it, right? So that's a sign of commitment. Emotional strength and maturity is crucial for a healthy relationship. It says, I'm emotionally strong enough to handle any problem. So when you have an emotionally strong and mature person, they are wired for commitment. They don't have the backdoor plan, escape plan, right? They're like, I can face any problem. And so they roll up their sleeves and deal with the problem. So emotional maturity creates that ability to commit because you're willing to do, and you believe in your abilities to deal with all the problems. So that's huge. And then, of course, a person who is emotionally strong and mature can own up to their part in the problems. So I think the biggest, key factor is emotional strength and maturity. That's why that was the number one trait that I was looking for when I decided it was okay to get back into the dating scene is this person emotionally strong and mature? And so that means they can pretty much handle any problem that comes to them, and they're able to deal with problems within themselves.
Within themselves. Okay. I think that makes a big difference. I love that. So emotional security, strength. I was listening to a book just the other day, and I love the comment that she made. It was called Atlas of the Heart. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular book, Brienne something. But she made a comment that vulnerability, and really that's what we're talking about. Are you willing to be vulnerable enough to communicate to your partner, you know what, these are some traumas that I've had, and when this event occurs, this is my response, and I recognize this is my issue, not yours.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But as she said, vulnerability takes courage.
Yeah, absolutely. It is like whenever we meet someone, it's like we take our heart and we place it in their hands and we say, please care for my heart as though it were your own. Right. And then, and so that is terrifying, can be terrifying because sometimes feels like they dropped our heart and they trampled on it. Right. So we go to pick it up again, but we want to cling to it. So vulnerability is saying, I'm willing to put my heart in your hands. And that is scary. But however, if we go back to like the beginning of our conversation, when we know our trauma, know our emotional pain, and really have done a lot of work to heal our own wounds, that puts us in such a emotionally strong position, that it is much easier to be vulnerable, right? We're not going into these relationships blind and with people who may not care for our heart because we've ignored the red flags, right? So I think vulnerability is scary, but I think, again, the more and more emotional strength that you have, the more you've dealt with those old wounds, I think it puts us all in a position of being able to navigate, these relationships and to be vulnerable. Because really, fear is an emotion, vulnerability, and so are we dealing with these emotions that come up? Yes or no, right? So if not, being vulnerable is going to be a really scary thing.
So have you found that there are some cultures, whether they be, family cultures, religious cultures, that can actually influence someone to jump into relationships when they really should take their time and be a little bit more careful?
Well, I think that there probably are, certain cultures where there's still arranged marriages and so to speak. So I think it certainly can influence the success of relationships and whether or not you can even deal with red flags or so I think probably that is the case. But again, I tend to look at all people. Even I get a lot of questions about men and women and the differences. And really, for me, it all comes down to we're all emotional beings. And yes, unfortunately, men have got the short end of the stick in the way that, it's been discouraged for them to explore their emotional sides, generally speaking. But I really even the cultural issues, if there are any, can all be linked to emotions oftentimes. So it really is worthwhile identifying what is the trauma, what is the emotional pain, and to what degree is this emotional pain still wreaking havoc on my life, whether it's, cultural issues that are going to trigger it and spark it, or anything else. I think for me, the root issue is usually linked to the childhood trauma. Did we deal with it or not? And if we haven't, I think life has a way. And this is why I absolutely love relationships. I think, a lot of times when these triggers happen, it can cause so much tension and so much division. For me, the way I look at it now is I think we are going to attract people in our life for the specific reason of activating our trauma. We can be angry and upset about it and reject it, or we can embrace it and say, how are the things they're doing impacting me, and how is this a familiar thing from my childhood, and really deal with it. So I think there's so much beauty in relationships. They're really the opportunity to heal old wounds if we know what to do, right? If we know what to look for.
And if we have a significant other that's not only willing to listen, but willing to do the same thing.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
What's your final message to the audience today?
Well, I think the final message would be, do whatever you can to identify the trauma and in your childhood, even if it is considered mild, right? And identify what emotional wounds or what trauma emotions were created because of it, and learn to tend to your own wounds rather than, it's kind of like we have these hamsters on the hamster wheels. We have, like, that was me. I had these old wounds I wasn't aware of, and I kept seeking and never finding, the solution out there. Is really to be aware, what are these old wounds and how have they impacted my life? And can I, learn to meet my own emotional wounds, learn to prove to myself that I'm enough or important or valuable. And I think that to me is really the root issue. So therefore that's the solution should be on that root issue, if that makes sense.
Wonderful. It does. And how do folks get a hold of you if they would love for you to help them?
Yeah, so my website is joyceschafers.com. So it's JoyceSchafers.com. You can get a hold of my phone numbers there. My email address is there. Then, of course, that's my website where you can read about my background and see the different offerings I have.
Well, thank you. This has been fascinating.
Good. Well, thank you so much for having me on your show.
I think we could go on and on and on.
I know I could. This is me and my playground, but I know we don't have unlimited.
Well, I have a lot of other questions for you, but we don't have the time for those. So anyway, thanks so much, Joyce. It's been wonderful. And folks, thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. And you know what? If you're experiencing those challenges, get a hold of Joyce. It sounds like you've got some answers for them.
I hope so. I think I do. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Take care.